In this week's video lecture, I'm going to highlight and expand upon some of the key aspects of your reading on the California State Legislature. We're going to take a look at some structural features of the state legislature, go into a little bit of detail about the legislative process or how a bill becomes a law, and we're going to discuss representation in the California State Legislature in just a little bit of detail. So we're going to start by looking at the structural features of the legislature. As your reading mentions, California has a bicameral state legislature, meaning that the legislature is broken into two separate chambers, the California State Assembly and the California State Senate. Much like the U.S. Congress, that's also a bicameral legislature with a House and Senate. In California, we call the lower chamber the Assembly rather than a House, but we have that same name, the Senate, for what's considered to be the higher chamber in the legislature. So California, like almost every other state in the country, Nebraska being the one exception, Nebraska being the only state with a unicameral legislature or one chamber, every other state mirrors the structure of the U.S. federal government by having two chambers of their legislature. And that reflects certain constitutional principles. As the U.S. Constitution was being designed and ratified, the idea was to have an additional layer of separation of powers. The lawmaking power considered to be the most crucial of governmental powers. And constitutional designers have long felt that dividing up that power into two separate chambers, where you need the agreement of each chamber, where the members are separately elected, so they represent different constituencies, by making sure that any piece of law or legislation needs to be approved by both chambers, that's a way of guarding against narrow short-term majorities from being able to dramatically restructure the laws, either at the state level with the state legislature or at the national level with the U.S. Congress. So California's state constitution in terms of legislative power resembles the U.S. Constitution in that there's a little bit of a status quo bias built in terms of how it's structured by making it a little bit more difficult for majorities to enact their will through the lawmaking process. When we look at state legislatures throughout the country, there's a huge amount of variation in terms of how they are set up for members of the legislature to do their jobs. And political scientists have created a term called professionalism, where at one end of the spectrum are what are considered to be highly professional state legislatures, and at the other end are what are sometimes referred to as citizen legislatures. So, both of those terms have generally positive connotations, but when we're talking about a professional legislature, we're basically talking about a legislature in which the people who serve in that institution, that is their full-time job or profession. So professional legislatures tend to have higher salaries. They tend to be more generously staffed, and they tend to have sessions that last longer. Citizen legislatures, on the other hand, tend to be relatively low pay, in general because they're considered to be part-time jobs, where being a legislator is not a person's primary occupation. These legislatures tend to be relatively poorly staffed, and they tend to have relatively short sessions. So perhaps not surprisingly, California falls at the professional end of the spectrum, generally ranking number one in terms of overall professionalism. So California state legislators are paid the highest salary in the country, currently a little over $110,000 a year. The state legislature has a pretty robust staff with over 2,000 legislative aides, providing support services to the legislature. That's actually a fairly substantial reduction. Prior to 1990, California had an even larger legislative staff. but a proposition passed in 1990 that imposed term limits also specified pretty dramatic reductions of about 40% in staff members to the state legislature. And in California, the session length tends to be rather long. Over each 2-year session of the state legislature, most of the time the legislature is in session in Sacramento. There are occasional recesses, but for the most part, the California legislature is in session on an ongoing basis. In many states, the session is much shorter, oftentimes a matter of months, usually from January until late spring or early summer. And in some states, the legislature only meets once every other year. So California is at kind of the opposite end, where the state legislature meets on an almost continuous basis. So one way of understanding the structure of our state legislature is to compare the two different chambers. So over on the state assembly side, we have 80 representatives who make up that body, whereas on the Senate side, it is 40 senators, basically half the size. So in California, a state of nearly 40 million people, that means that in the state assembly, each representative represents nearly 500,000 Californians, a pretty large district size in terms of population as state legislatures go. But that's dwarfed by the state Senate side, where each member of the California State Senate represents nearly 1 million Californians. That's actually larger than U.S. congressional districts in the U.S. House of Representatives. So we are talking about big, highly populated districts where people who represent us in Sacramento are representing very large districts. In both the state assembly and the state senate, our elected officials make a salary of a little over $110,000 per year. In the state assembly, as your textbook describes, that chamber is led by the Speaker of the Assembly, a very powerful leader in that chamber. And on the Senate side, the Senate President pro tempore, or sometimes referred to as the President pro tem, is the leader of that chamber. One last way of getting a handle on the structural features of California's state legislature is to look at the impact of direct democracy. And California voters, through propositions that have appeared on the ballot, have made some rather dramatic structural changes to the state legislature. First, in terms of term limits. Back in the year 1990, California was one of the first states, along with Colorado and Oklahoma, who also acted in that year, to enact term limits on state legislators. Now, Prop 140 originally placed a limit of 6 years of service in the House and 8 years in the Senate. That was recently changed through Proposition 28, which voters approved in the year 2012, which changed the limits to 12 years total in the legislature. So rather than having separate limits for the Assembly and the State Senate, now it's just a 12-year total, which can be divided up between the Assembly and the Senate, or can simply be 12 years of service in one chamber or the other. In terms of redistricting, California is one of a handful of states that has approved a Citizens Redistricting Commission. In other words, has taken the responsibility for drawing those district lines out of the hands of the state legislature itself and placed it in the hands of a Citizens Commission. And that was put in place through Proposition 11 in the year 2008. I know we've talked about the Redistricting Commission in a previous module, so I'm not going to go into great detail here, but just another way in which the voters have decided to impose certain rules and restrictions on the state legislature. Finally, California voters in a number of different ballot initiatives or propositions have put into place supermajority requirements for changes. And right now we have supermajority requirements for tax increases only. And those were originally put into place through Proposition 13 in the year 1978. Those requirements were made even stricter in the year 2010 through Proposition 26, which also imposed a supermajority requirement for things like fees as well as taxes. So the state legislature must have a 2/3 majority in each chamber in order to increase taxes. There had also been a 2/3 majority requirement simply to pass the budget. So every year there needed to be 2/3 of each chamber of the state legislature to pass a budget. That regularly resulted in the state legislature being unable to pass a budget on time, much to the consternation of the entire state. There would be long periods of time in which the state would be operating without a permanent budget. So that requirement was lifted in 2010 with Proposition 25. So since that proposition, the budget can now be enacted by a simple majority, so long as there are not tax increases involved. Okay, the next element of the state legislature that I'd like to take a look at is the legislative process. In other words, how a bill works its way through the state legislature to ultimately becoming law. The first step of the legislative process is a bill is introduced into the legislature. And a bill can only be introduced by a legislator of the chamber. So a representative in the state assembly is the only one who can introduce a bill in the state assembly. And a California state senator is the only people who can introduce bills in the state senate. Now, ideas for bills can come from all sorts of places. It can be a member of the public who's contacted a legislator. It can be the governor who has an idea about legislation. It can be executive branch agencies, part of the bureaucracy that might recommend changes to existing law. It can be certainly interest groups and lobbyists might recommend legislation. But ultimately, it's up to a legislator, him or herself, to decide whether or not to put a piece of legislation forward for formal consideration in the chamber. After a bill is introduced, it is referred to a committee. And both the California State Assembly as well as the State Senate break down their workload into a number of different subject area committees. So this allows for a little bit of specialization within the state legislature. So you might have legislators who serve on an education committee where they get to develop a great deal of expertise on educational issues, for instance, during their service in the state legislature. And it's in committee where most of the legislative work is done. These are the real workhorses of a legislature, because once a committee has a bill referred to it, if that committee, and in particular if that committee chairperson, chooses to take action on that bill, that committee will hold hearings where they will ask interested parties to come forward and testify about the bill. This is critically important for legislators to gather information about both the policy changes that are being proposed. In other words, what impact the bill is actually going to have out there in the real world. And also for legislators to gather information about the politics of the bill. Who is lining up in support of and in opposition to the bill? That gives legislators good information about what kind of political minefield this individual bill is going to be needing to navigate through. In addition to hearings, committees also engage in what's called markup. And this is literally where legislators go through the bill, marking up line by line changes to the original bill. So in other words, amending the bill, getting it ready for prime time, if you will. After having heard from interested parties and experts, that committee is going to want to make changes to get that bill as strong as possible before reporting it out or sending it back to the full chamber. If a majority of the committee that's been considering the bill votes to approve the bill, it's called reporting out the bill. And when a bill is reported out, it is sent back to the full chamber for what's called floor action. And floor action is simply when the chamber meets in its entirety to consider bills. So floor action would include things like debate over the bill, amendments might be offered and voted on, and then ultimately a final vote on the bill is taken. And if a majority votes in favor of the bill at this stage, it moves on to the next step in the process. If a majority is opposed, then that's basically the end of the line for that bill, and it dies. All right, so if a bill makes it through floor action in one chamber and receives a majority vote in favor by that chamber, then the next step is that the bill will then be considered by the other chamber. And usually what happens is the bill will be sent to the other chamber, and it will be referred to a committee for further hearings and more markup in that committee, and then floor action in the other chamber. Now, if that second chamber to consider the bill, if they pass that bill without any amendments, so in other words, they pass the same version of the bill that the first chamber passed, then that bill goes to the governor. But usually what will happen is the second chamber will pass a bill with amendments. So once that second chamber gets a hold of the bill, it's going to be different legislators dealing with that bill in their own committee. They're going to have different ideas about what the best piece of legislation is going to look like. So they're going to probably make some changes to that bill. So in that case, then we have one chamber that passes one version of a bill and the second chamber passing a different version of the bill. So what can happen then? One option is the second chamber can then send the bill back to the original chamber, and that original chamber can then vote to approve the changes that the second chamber made, in which case the bill will then go to the governor. Or oftentimes what happens is a conference committee is appointed. And this is a committee made up of members of both the Assembly and the Senate. And their sole purpose is to iron out the differences between the two versions of the bill. Because for any piece of legislation to become law, it needs to be passed through each chamber with identical legislative language. So oftentimes the conference committee will haggle out the differences between the two chambers' versions of the bill, and then it'll be sent back for a vote in each chamber. So once both chambers pass an identical version of the bill, it then goes to the governor. Okay, there are a few different options for what the governor can do, but it ultimately boils down to two basic options that apply for most bills. The governor may either sign a bill or veto a bill. If the governor signs the bill, it then becomes law. But the governor may veto a bill. And if that happens, the bill will then die and not become law, unless it is overridden by a 2/3 majority vote in each chamber of the state legislature. That works much like a presidential veto of a bill passed by Congress at the national level. But there's one critical difference with the governor's veto in California as well as in many other states. And that is the governor has the power of the line item veto. So this has to do with spending bills, also sometimes called appropriations bills. When the state legislature passes a bill for state government agencies to spend money, it's said that the state legislature appropriates that money for agencies to spend. So the governor, through the power of the line item veto, may veto individual spending items in those bills while allowing the rest of the bill to become law. So it's a way for the governor to strike out individual pieces of government spending that he or she does not like or does not support. Those can be overridden with a 2/3 vote of each chamber of the state legislature. But the key selling point of the line item veto for the governor is it allows the governor to strike out individual components of a bill that he or she does not like while allowing the rest of that bill to become law. So how many bills make it through this arduous process of being enacted into law? The most recent numbers that I have access to are for the 2021/22 session, in which 1,733 out of 4,389 bills that were introduced ultimately became law, or about a 40% success rate. That's actually quite a bit higher than the national average across state legislatures, which is closer to about 20%, but remains something of a downturn from the 1980s and 90s, in particular, when the California state legislature was passing about 3,000 new laws in every 2-year session. So that's quite a lot of bills becoming law in a 2-year period. Most of them are relatively small in terms of their overall impact, mostly representing relatively narrow tweaks to existing law, oftentimes as a result of feedback that they might have received from, let's say, an executive branch agency about how maybe a particular law is not working out under current circumstances. And so the legislature will go in and make a small adjustment. But the California state legislature, as well as state legislatures throughout the country, do pass rather significant pieces of legislation. That contrasts pretty significantly with the United States Congress, where only about 3 to 5% of bills that are introduced in the US Congress actually find their way enacted into law. So in terms of legislation and putting new policies on the books, state legislatures really are where the action is at right now in terms of lawmaking in the US. And we're going to finish up our consideration of the California state legislature with just a little bit of detail on representation. So you're probably already pretty familiar with one aspect of representation, something political scientists sometimes call substantive representation, which is the idea that people who are elected by the citizenry reflect the political interests of the people who have elected them. So in other words, the extent to which your representative represents your views on various issues of consideration before government. But I want to talk about a different type of representation, and that's descriptive representation. And that gets at the degree to which people who are elected to serve as representatives in the state legislature reflect politically relevant demographic characteristics of the public. So in other words, how closely do the folks who make up the California state legislature look like the state of California as a whole in terms of things like race and ethnicity, gender, social class, religion, and age? California is becoming more descriptively representative in its state legislature, but still has a good ways to go. The legislature does not resemble the state as a whole. And California is a little bit behind some other states, in particular states like Oregon and Nevada. So rather than giving you all the statistics, I'd like you to engage in a little bit of research to find out how descriptively representative the California state legislature is. And the website Cal Matters has a good interactive, which I will link in this module for you to be able to find easily. And just spend a couple of minutes exploring that interactive and take a look at how representative the state legislature is in terms of things like race and ethnicity, gender, and age. One other aspect of representation that is somewhat unique in California has to do with district size. Our representatives represent huge legislative districts in terms of population. Our California State Assembly districts are 3 times larger in terms of population than the lower chamber of any other state's state legislature. So we're talking about much larger districts. And the state Senate, Texas is close to California in terms of district size, but every other state in the country is at least half the size or smaller in terms of state Senate districts, population sizes. So that has some impacts. That means that California is going to have extremely expensive campaigns for state legislature. If you're representing 500,000 or 1 million people, that's a lot of voters that you need to try to get your message out to, which generally means through mass media marketing campaigns. So as I mentioned in a previous module, can regularly cost over $1 million to successfully run for a seat in the California state legislature. It also means we've got a more impersonal style of politics in California than in some other states. So a state like New Hampshire, where there's 1 representative in the state house for every 3,000 people, that's going to be a much more personal style of politics, where individual legislators get to know their voters or their constituents, in pretty close personal detail. They're generally going to be knocking on pretty much every door in the district come election time, trying to gain support of the voters. It's very different in California. California's legislators are quite a bit more removed from the general public than legislators that have much smaller district sizes. So how well does the California State Legislature do at actually representing the interests of Californians? One way to answer that question would be to take a look and see whether Californians actually approve of the job that the state legislature is doing. And fortunately, the people at the Public Policy Institute of California fairly regularly survey Californians about their impressions of how well the legislature is doing. So in January of 2022, PPIC asked a survey question: overall, do you approve or disapprove of the way the California State Legislature is handling its job? And at that time, 47% of Californians approved of the job that the state legislature was doing, while 39% disapproved. Now that may seem fairly mediocre, more people approving of the job the legislature is doing than disapproving, but not by a huge margin. But this actually represents a huge improvement over where the legislature stood in the public's eyes, just a decade or so prior to that. So back in 2010, PPIC conducted a similar survey, and at that time they found that only 16% of the public approved of the job being done by the California State Legislature, while 72% disapproved. Now obviously 2010 was a very different time from 2022. At that time the state was in the depths of the Great Recession, but there was also seen to be a lot of gridlock and dysfunction in the state legislature. And this is in large part because this was before the 2/3 supermajority requirement to pass the budget was lifted. So pretty regularly on a yearly basis, Californians were reading about how the legislature couldn't adopt a budget on time because of haggling, especially between the Democrats and Republicans over the budget. Now, since that time, the Democratic Party has become much more dominant in the state legislature, and the 2/3 supermajority rule for passing the budget has been lifted. So that's allowed an easier time for Democrats to pass legislation in general and the budget in particular. That might not result in greater approval among Republicans, but it does result in fewer stories about squabbling and conflict between the two parties at the state legislature. So that's probably part of what's going on in terms of the improvement of the state legislature in the public's eyes over that 10 to 12 year period. Still, it's really notable that even as the state's politics in 2020 and 2021 were embroiled in controversy over how to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The public has not directed its anger at the state legislature, during the most recent crisis, the way that it did during another major crisis a decade earlier.